This is John Ziegler, and you're watching the Break It Down Show.
Yes, indeed. We're on the Break It Down show on location. These are always exciting when we have to go live and figure out just what the heck we're doing here, John. This is fun. You've got a new podcast out. You've been a guest on the show before talking about the Penn State Sandusky child abuse scandal. And I suppose we should now say /hoax because there's some hoaxy elements to this. But more importantly, you've got a new podcast out. It's episode 4 is out now, and
as we speak, actually, episode 5
has dropped. Okay,
so it's a 19-episode podcast. It's called "With the Benefit of Hindsight," and it takes a very, very, very deep dive into the entire Penn State Joe Paterno, Jerry Sandusky, quote unquote, scandal from every possible aspect. And these are 19 episodes that are incredibly extensive. Some of these episodes are up to 3.5 hours. Sometimes I think one of them might even be 4.5 hours long. And it's 19 episodes, and it's with a co-host by the name of Liz Habib, who is the TV sports anchor at the Fox affiliate here in the Los Angeles market. And she plays kind of the role of the audience, one holding me accountable, two asking questions that the average listener may have. And, she actually went to the University of Pittsburgh, which is Penn State's rival, and she had a brother who played football at Penn State. So she's kind of the perfect person to have as my co-host. And we go back a long way. We actually, ironically enough, co-hosted the news at an NBC affiliate in Ohio 30 years ago. And the ironic part is that I was the sports guy and she was the news person. And now I'm doing more newsy stuff and she's a sports person. So that's a unique aspect to the podcast. It adds a lot of entertainment value to it. And also I think it really helps the listener who isn't deeply acquainted with this story, because there are, like a lot of stories that are complex, there's very different levels of knowledge. I think everybody has a very basic kind of kindergarten knowledge of I remember that. Penn State, Joe Paterno, Jerry Sandusky, that was terrible. What a horrible scandal. Everyone was guilty, and this was the worst thing that ever happened. And Penn State got punished severely and paid out over $100 million to victims of sex abuse. I think most people have that level of knowledge. Mm-hmm. I feel at certain times I'm teaching a PhD course because this thing is so much different than what we were told. It's so much more interesting. Yeah. If that narrative had been true, I wouldn't have been interested in this story more than 20 minutes.
I want to color a little bit, because you're talking about, like, I'm listening, doing all the prep, listening. I listen to our old episodes, and there are so many facets to this. When something this, first, let's just, because we want to make sure everybody understands. Abusing children is terrible. It's horrible. None of us want this. We're not saying in any way advocating for that act, but you have to say these things up front. So,
let me stop you right there. Obviously, that's true.
Right.
As you know, I have 2 young daughters. I actually think the fact that we even have to say that is exactly how this story was allowed to happen.
Right.
Because it's only in a story where everyone has to apologize for seeking the truth that the truth can get this lost.
Right.
You see what I'm saying?
Yeah, no, and I totally agree. We have to say it because then they'll take it down from different sites. Like, it's just trying to be clear, like up front, like this is not in defense of child abuse. It's to understand these things. And the PhD level course thing is really important to what you're talking about. So I guess what I want to say is, who else has, like, if it's not you, who else has the overarching view? Because you've been doing this for 10 years. I mean, you know this thing inside and out. Does anybody else have the pieces? And then do they have a different viewpoint on this?
Well, in my experience, every single person that has ever looked at this extensively and objectively has come to effectively my conclusion. Right. And I'm hardly the only one. Mark Pendergrast, who is a well-known author for decades, written award-winning books. He was shocked, although he shouldn't have been, because I told him this is what was going to happen. Yeah. That this particular book that he wrote about this case, called The Most Hated Man in America, was not able to find a mainstream publisher and was ignored by the critics. I told him that was what was going to happen. But I recommend that book, although I don't agree with everything in it. our conclusions are basically the same, that he concludes that he believes Jerry Sandusky is innocent.
Mhm.
And Malcolm Gladwell, and the reason why this podcast with the Benefit of Hindsight really even exists is because Malcolm Gladwell wrote a book in 2019 where he uses a chapter in that book. This is his bestseller, Talking to Strangers. He uses an entire chapter to delve into this case. And he uses very extensively my work on the case. And he cites me by name. He and I had talked extensively before he wrote the book. And he was the first really mainstream person. Malcolm Gladwell is revered by many people, especially on the left, as an intellectual and a contrarian. And in my view, Malcolm took a probably smart, but very strategic view of this thing. His whole take was, well, there's a lot of questions here that haven't been answered. Some of this doesn't make sense. Sandusky, the case against him is shrouded in mystery. And this is not an open and shut case. And then he says, in an interview that I did with him, that he's glad that I've been trying to find out the truth here because he has questions. I believe that in real life, Malcolm Gladwell knows that I'm right. Otherwise, he wouldn't have been citing my work and he wouldn't have even taken this on.
Right.
But he's got a lot to lose. And one of them, it kind of goes back to what you said about we have to apologize for even delving into this. The perfect storm, there's so many elements of the perfect storm.
Yeah.
One of them here is that nobody with anything to lose is willing to tell the truth about this case because it is one of those situations where you can be canceled. And so Malcolm Gladwell, I think Malcolm Gladwell thought he was going incredibly far and being very courageous, and that his chapter was going to spark a whole new level of interest among the news media.
Right.
And I told him, Malcolm, that's not going to happen in this case.
Yeah.
One chapter, even in a best-selling book, his book was on the bestsellers list for at least 28 weeks or something. Even that isn't going to be enough in this day and age because everybody who matters in the news media, everyone who has any power, any credibility, in the mainstream, is never going to take this on. There's nothing in it for them.
Right. And
they also have to admit that either they or all their colleagues got it incredibly wrong. And there are stories that occasionally get fixed.
Yeah.
I've related this story kind of to, obviously Duke Lacrosse is a good example. I think there are elements of Theranos that are involved here. I think the Manti Te'o story is similar to some of this. I think that Jussie Smollett is similar to this. All of those four that I just cited, they got fixed to a certain degree.
To a certain degree.
Because, in large part, the system and the media didn't put all their chips down on it, right? Yeah. They corrected sort of Jussie Smollett, not as much as they should have,
right?
Because they didn't put everything on it.
Right.
In the Penn State case, they went all in just a couple of days back in November of 2011, almost 10 years ago. They went all in on a narrative.
Yeah.
And if that narrative is not just a little wrong, but totally wrong, their credibility is obliterated. And so there's no one with a self-interest. And trust me, I have tried almost everybody.
Yeah.
People who I had great respect for in the journalism field before all this, who I've had conversations with, who had every reason to find me credible, who knew me, I'm talking about multiple people. I'm talking about people like Michael Isikoff, Bernie Goldberg, Christine Brennan, people who know me, who covered this story and who would not even accept the concept that I'm right, even after extensive communication with me. And it's because they have no self-interest in doing so. And so podcasting is really the only venue left where you can reach a large audience, potentially, if you have a good product, where you're not having to go through the gatekeepers of the mainstream news media. And there's never been a story, Pete, in my opinion, where the mainstream news media gatekeepers have it more on lockdown than this one, except maybe the contrarian view of how we reacted to COVID. And ironically enough, I think that there are, and I've had some people come to me proactively and say, oh my God, in the last year, oh my God, I now understand what happened at Penn State because I saw what happened in the reaction to COVID. And those two things seem very different, but they're actually incredibly similar.
Let me spend some time with this because you're bringing up a lot of things that I wanted to get into. First off, everybody should go listen to With the Benefit of Hindsight on whatever podcast platform. I've been listening to it on Audible. That's a good one. But it's on iTunes. It's everywhere. One of the things about this whole case that's always been interesting and yet baffling at the same time. Let me back up. Malcolm Gladwell's book. I read this book. And part of the reason why the book is so important and why that chapter was so important is he's talking about our inability to read people. You know, like if you're just an awkward person who is accused of a crime and look, he just acts guilty. It's like, well, actually, totally wrong. You know, in this case, this person just acted weird because whatever, emotionally or whatever, they're uncomfortable being addressed in this way. They talked about the computer's ability to predict better than regular people if someone would recidivate or violate probation or whatever it was, right? All these different things. And so they're talking about the validity of the things that we see. And if a story is so poisoned, and the Smollett thing is a great example. A friend of mine, Will Riley, has been on the show a bunch of times. He wrote a whole book on hate crime, hoaxes. And there's less money on the table, to use your example, well, because nobody wants to be on the side of child abuse. It's hard to be, if it's child abuse versus the truth, you know, it's really tough to sort that out. I had another guy on the show, Phil Chalmers. He focuses on psychopaths, you know, and he's like, these people are criminally insane. You can't have them out of jail because they don't work like we do. And I'm like, what about child molesters? And he's like, I don't know what we do with those guys. You have to let them out because that's how we do it as a society. But they're dangerous. You can't keep them locked up all the time because and it's really tough to sort these things out. So we have this problem with the zeitgeist and how we see something like this. And you bring it up in the podcast, and it's a great point. Like from the time when this allegedly happens, there's a whole shift in terms of towards the Catholic Church and then believing victims a lot more, just like a blanket belief. You know, these things have proven to be false. And I think another example that really pays out is the Duke scandal. If those kids were at North Carolina, NC State, and they weren't well-moneyed kids, they'd be done. They wouldn't have had the lawyers who could apply the right kind of pressure, you know, and the connections. I mean, and maybe that's an unfair statement, but I really believe that money and their ability to create influence at the highest levels, because you bring up this up a lot, and then I'm going to let you talk about it. But there's a lot of politics in this. Like if the governor or the DA or the attorney general, if they don't like someone at State College, Penn State, then there's a lever to pull to maybe get that person out. There's a vendetta or bills to be paid that have nothing to do with child abuse.
Well, let me address this in the big picture. I am an ardent anti-conspiracy person. Right? The first thing that people think of when they hear there's a podcast that says that Jerry Sandusky was innocent, they go, first of all, that's lunacy. Second of all, this must be some massive conspiracy to get Jerry Sandusky. No. That's not what this is at all. In fact, this is an anti-conspiracy theory that I believe is way more than a theory. But ironically, the only conspiracy people here, Pete, are those who think that Penn State administrators and Joe Paterno somehow had an incentive or motivation to cover up the sex crimes against children of a former assistant coach. Yeah. I mean, when there's no evidence to support that, nor any logic at all, in all sorts of things, which we go through in the podcast, would have been totally different if there had been an actual cover-up. Those are the conspiracy theories. So I'm an ardent anti-conspiracy theorist. What happened in this case is a perfect storm of circumstances, which incentivizes everyone in perverse ways. And I believe the most fundamental perverse incentive comes from Penn State and Penn Staters. People think that Penn State somehow had an incentive to defend itself against these allegations that they were covering up for Jerry Sandusky. Right. That's not just untrue. It's the opposite of the truth. Penn State, once they panic, again, going back to the COVID thing.
Yeah.
When you make decisions in a panic, it's never a good idea. But when they panic in the middle of a media firestorm, when they fire the great Joe Paterno and the president of the university, Graham Spanier, who was highly respected, and he was in the academic realm, he was almost a Paterno-like figure. So when they do that and they effectively brand this story forever as, yep, it's a Penn State story, we did it, we're pleading guilty, everyone thinks that guilty plea must be legitimate.
Right.
No. The people in charge at Penn State, they have a huge, massive incentive to throw their own university under the bus for a number of reasons. Some of them are political, some of them are personal. As far as the money is concerned, it's not their money.
Yeah.
The only thing that's happening to people at Penn State who are giving away this money to these accusers is that they're being patted on the back at cocktail parties for doing such a great job of getting us through this scandal, and they're being congratulated in the pages of the New York Times for finally getting it and realizing that football is out of control and that we have to do the right thing to these victims. So there's no negative impact to the people who are doing this, and even more dramatically than that, I want you to think about the members of the Penn State Board of Trustees, those 32 people who in this panic fire Joe Paterno and Graham Spanier. Their entire reputations for all time are determined on the validity of that decision. That is the thing they're going to be most well known for their entire lives. They instantly become invested in the idea that the narrative that caused them to do that must be true. Much like governors who lock down their state, for over a year because of a virus. They are invested in the effectiveness and truthfulness of that, because if not, they just kept our kids out of school for no reason for over a year.
Yeah.
So they're never going. They're going to do not only never give up that narrative, they're going to do everything they can to facilitate that narrative, and they get to control the narrative because the media is on their side here, because the media fell for it too in those original days. So for the last 9 years, because of this perfect storm of circumstances, I have been going uphill into the wind on ice with lead bricks around my feet, knowing, and let's be clear, I didn't know at the beginning that all of this was false.
Yeah.
I had a strong suspicion that a large part of this story was false. It wasn't until I got deeply into this for 2 or 3 years and I realized, oh my God, the whole thing is not just false. It's obviously false. There is literally no way to make the entire totality of this story make any sense unless there was no child molestation by Jerry Sandusky or anybody else, other than maybe some of the guardians of some of these accusers, like the stepdad of victim number 1, Aaron Fisher, who I do believe abused Aaron Fisher. And we actually have an interview with Aaron Fisher's soon-to-be ex-wife that's coming up in the podcast, which is extraordinary that she even spoke to me, since he was the key accuser in the whole case. And she makes it very clear that she believes that he was abused not by Jerry Sandusky necessarily, but by the former stepdad, Eric Daniels, who happens to have been convicted of 100 counts of child molestation and child pornography.
This is the thing about this whole case. And by the way, great, you haven't gone 100 miles an hour yet. This is good.
Trying to calm down.
You get fired up. But there's all these things where, child abuse, it's horrible. But we have a guy who's actually a child abuser in the household. They got people making hundreds of millions of dollars are floating towards people who don't have anything. You have horrible timelines that don't match up. There's all these hallmarks of there not being anything, and yet there's 45 convictions on the back of Sandusky.
Yeah, Sandusky was convicted of 45 counts of child molestation.
So how do you balance that?
Because the trial was an abomination.
Okay,
I mean, even if Jerry Sandusky was guilty, and actually this actually worked against my efforts in this case, because the trial was so bad that when I went on the Today Show the first time, Matt Lauer I did not anticipate this, asked me 3 times whether or not Jerry Sandusky was guilty. And the first 2 times I tried not to answer because at that point I was starting to have my doubts after having interviewed Jerry Sandusky for 3.5 hours in prison. And I knew that was going to completely, throw people aside on my primary point at that juncture, which was that Joe Paterno was innocent in this.
Yeah.
And so the third time I say, well, he's probably guilty of most, if not all, of what he was accused of, but there were major due process problems with the trial. The trial was a joke, even if he was guilty. Let me just give you a couple of bullet points of what.
And is there any physical evidence? Because we've learned so much about witness testimony being flawed.
Well, okay. Before I address the absurdity of the trial, because this is important.
Yeah.
People think that in child molestation cases, there's no evidence. I think that was a perception that somehow allowed people to believe without any evidence at all that Jerry Sandusky was guilty. That is not true. Okay. The normal serial child molester, especially male on male, child molestation story is remarkably similar. And for the last 10 years, I've looked at every single one of them that becomes news. Yeah. And not one of them follows the pattern of Jerry Sandusky. Here's the normal pattern. There is a parent or guardian that becomes suspicious. The police talk to the accuser, usually fairly contemporaneous to any actual abuse. If the story checks out, they're able to get a warrant for the computer of the person who is accused. Guess what they find on the computer? They find lots of child pornography. They find emails. They find all sorts of evidence. With that, they then either get a confession or there's a plea bargain. There's hardly ever a trial. Though once that conviction happens, there's almost never an appeal because the person knows they're guilty. In fact, sometimes the molester is at least subconsciously happy they've been caught because they feel like they have this illness that has overtaken them, and they hate that they have this. Yeah. And so this is the way the normal case goes. None of that happens in this case. Yeah. There is no pornography, not a shred of pornography in this case, not a shred. And Jerry Sandusky, I have gone to great lengths to show, was not capable of hiding pornography of any sort. He's a technical dunce. He didn't even know how to use a cell phone. Yeah. I mean, the guy did not hide pornography. There was also no evidence of drug use, alcohol, or payoffs in this case, which is critical for a case, especially this is where political correctness, Pete, plays such a huge role in why this went down the way that it did. The idea that heterosexual boys from the ages of 11 to 14, and they're all heterosexual, as far as I can tell, and I've researched all of them. The idea that heterosexual boys, teenagers, post-puberty, most of them, during most of the time period, were continually seeing an older male who was abusing them sexually and saying nothing to anyone about this is an inherent absurdity. Okay, that is an absurdity in the real world. Now, can it happen? Sure, if the person who is abusing those boys is giving them a massive incentive to endure the abuse, like paying them lots of money or giving them drugs or plying them with alcohol. There's not a shred of evidence of any of that.
What about just revealing the truth, like saying, "Oh, I'll tell everybody that you've had sex with men or whatever," and that could be some kind
There's all sorts of I mean,
but there's no evidence of these things actually happening.
There's no evidence. There's no contemporaneous reports.
And these are boys that have the ability to get away from Jerry Sandusky.
Well, why do you keep coming back
for years?
For years. The victim number one, Aaron Fisher, by the time he got to trial, although his story had evolved dramatically, but by the time he got
the hallmark of a hoax.
Right. Yeah. I mean, dramatically evolves over several years. By the time he's at trial, he's claiming that he was abused 100 times by Jerry Sandusky. Now, this is a very, very heterosexual teenage boy who is already, based upon my interviews with his wife and with his close friends, he's already having sex with girls, at a very, very young age. The idea that somehow he's decided, yeah, I'm going to keep going back to Jerry Sandusky's house for 100 times. I'm not going to tell anybody.
Right.
And by the way, there's all sorts of places where there should be evidence in this case where there's not. Like, for instance, if Aaron Fisher was really being abused by Jerry Sandusky or in the form of oral sex, forced oral sex, 100 times, I'm sorry, his mother, who's a key figure in this, would have found some evidence in the laundry.
Yeah.
This is not an act that doesn't leave evidence. Okay.
Yeah.
Can we use our common sense for half a second here? Yet there's not a shred of that. Nothing. So there's no evidence where there should be any evidence at all. And as far as,
and it also takes a degree of privacy to do these things, except for like they're doing it in a public locker room. If an adult came to my house and wanted to go squirrel away in the bedroom with my kid, like that ain't happening. Like not over and over and over again. Like you guys don't need to be behind closed, like whatever you're doing.
Well, to that point, I do want to get back to the issue of, you mentioned the Catholic Church scandal.
Right.
I think that's an important part of this. But before that, on the privacy issue, everyone fixates, understandably, in this case, on the alleged shower episodes on Penn State's campus. And in the public perception, my God, why is he showering with young boys on Penn State's campus? And I get that. Yeah. I get that is weird, that's stupid. In my opinion, Jerry Sandusky looked at these guys as his sons. I think he's a guy who doesn't understand physical boundaries. I think he was living in a different era. I'm not even sure that he has the same concept of sexuality that quote unquote average person does. In my opinion, it's not I'm not an expert in this, but based upon my reading of his medical records and my reading of this case and my time spent with him, and I spent time with a lot of football coaches in my life, Pete. I've coached football, I've covered football. He is the most asexual, not homosexual, asexual,
like a worm,
asexual person I have ever met in that realm. And so I think that, potentially plays a role here. But if he was really so fixated on this idea of showering with boys, why is there not one allegation at trial? And now that we have been leaked all the settlement documents from Penn State of the 36, 37 alleged accusers, I've gone through all of them.
Right.
I've gone through all the settlement documents, and there's not one allegation of Jerry Sandusky ever even attempting to have a shower with a boy in his home. Why is that? When the home would be the safest place for him to do this. By the way, these Penn State showers are massive places.
The locker room showers,
where you cannot corner somebody. You have no physical domination over somebody. So why is it that it's not at home and instead it's at Penn State in these semi-public or private, depending on how you want to phrase it. But I mean, there's a lot of people who have access to these showers, these massive places. Why is it supposedly happening there all the time? Well, I believe, having researched this for 9 years, that we know of 2 documented cases, 2 years apart, over 2.5 years apart, where a shower occurred on Penn State's campus. I'll grant that there were probably more than 2 that just never got documented for whatever reason because they weren't considered that big of a deal. Yeah. But I believe that there are 2 episodes that were documented. Why is the perception that there's more than that? Because that's what Penn State was paying millions of dollars for. So when you create a market for stories where Jerry Sandusky is having a shower with a boy on Penn State's campus, guess what you're gonna get? You're gonna get stories of, I showered with Jerry on Penn State's campus, because if it wasn't on Penn State's campus, Penn State wasn't gonna pay for it. Right. So that's what happened. Now back to the Catholic Church issue which you raised, which to me is an incredibly important part of the perfect storm here. You talked about how perceptions have evolved now that we think of this story, this issue of child sex abuse in a different way. There's a perfect storm element here, Pete, where these incidents occurred before the Catholic Church scandal becomes well-known, thought of. It was not really a thing.
Yeah.
So in 1998 and in late 2000, the Catholic Church scandal is not a ubiquitous known concept. So the idea of showering with a boy in Happy Valley, Pennsylvania, where nothing bad ever happens, and you're Jerry Sandusky living this ideal life, and you run a massive charity, and you've got this sterling reputation, and you grew up in a rec home where everyone's showering with everybody else, is not that big a deal.
Right.
I know for people who have never been acquainted with the football culture or the athletic culture, they think, oh my God, that sounds terrible. This was not that big of a deal, and Jerry was not the only one that did this in this time period. So the incidents occur before the Catholic Church scandal, but here's the perfect storm part, Pete.
Okay.
The perfect storm is that they come out in public consciousness. In other words, they get reported after the Catholic Church scandal. So in the minds of the public, oh my God, how could anybody do this if they weren't a pedophile? Because we're now looking at everything very differently through the prism of this Catholic Church scandal. And the Catholic Church scandal does another thing. It creates the impression that everyone already has seen this movie, where the casting is literally perfect and it's set in stone by the media in a day. Wait a minute, Joe Paterno, he's the Pope. He's even Italian Catholic. The administrators, they're the cardinals covering all this up. Sandusky is the pedophile priest.
Yeah.
The Penn State fans, they're the Catholic parishioners looking the other way to enable their sacred institution, their religion of college football. This all fits in people's minds. And so the incidents are not being perceived through the proper prism. They're being seen through the prism of 2011, which is different than before the Catholic Church scandal. And I would add one other thing with regard to the Catholic Church scandal. And I've already alluded to it with regard to this being a case of alleged homosexual sex acts against heterosexual boys, which in my mind, having been a heterosexual teenage boy and been around a lot of heterosexual teenage boys, it is a preposterous notion on its face. But the great misperception of the Catholic Church scandal, and I grew up Catholic, went to Catholic grade school, high school, college, at Georgetown University, I can tell you that the vast majority, not all, but the vast majority of those cases were gay priests preying on boys that they either knew to be gay or thought were showing signs of being gay, and therefore would be potentially open to the advances and would not, and especially coming from a authority figure attached to God, right? So that's how most of those cases happen. That's not the case here. Jerry Sandusky is been married to Dottie Sandusky forever. They've never had biological children, which I think is an interesting part of this story and has been misperceived. But there's no signs that where's the gay affair that Jerry Sandusky ever had? Right. I mean, there's zero evidence of that, and there's zero evidence that any of these for someone who was supposedly the most prolific and expert pedophile in Pennsylvania history, and Jim Clemente, the fraudulent sex crimes expert who was the consultant on the TV show Criminal Minds, who actually helped write the Paterno report, and with whom I've had many conversations, and turned out I realized too late he was a fraud. This guy claimed that Jerry Sandusky was in the top 1% of pedophiles, because this was the way he got away with this without leaving any evidence, and he never got caught for all these years. He's in the top 1%. Yet how is it that he can't pick one gay teenage boy?
Yeah.
If he's the greatest at this, why is he picking only heterosexual boys? That doesn't make any sense. So no one. Once we made our decision on this in 2.5 days with no information. It's almost impossible to go back because the dominoes started falling, not in a conspiratorial way, in a way where everyone is following their own perceived self-interest.
What evidence? So reporters are getting Pulitzer Prizes for this, and I'm highly critical of the modern media because they're incented to create sensation. They want salacious. This is what sells. It's not the quality and the integrity that sells. It's salaciousness. So what what reporter looks at this case with all of these problems with dates and, all the incentives, money, whatever it is to tell this tale? Why are you the only one who's been fighting this and fighting it for so hard? If there have to be other journalists that look at this and go, this is messed up.
Well, there have been a few, as I mentioned, Mark Pendergrass, Malcolm Gladwell, Ralph Cipriano, former LA Times and Philadelphia Inquirer reporter. He has a blog that's largely devoted to this case.
Yeah.
There are other mainstream reporters who I've spoken to who are still working on this case. Whether or not they will have the courage to actually get it across the end zone line, I don't know, because I've seen in the past where people have come close and then they wimp out at the last second because you take this one on, it's a huge risk.
Yeah.
Now, you mentioned winning Pulitzer Prizes. The woman who won the Pulitzer Prize in this case is someone, to me, people should take a look at. Her name is Sarah Gannon. Right now, I want you to think about this logically. I realize logically, we don't do that anymore. We don't think logically.
Okay.
But tell me how this scenario makes any sense to you.
Right.
So this is what we're told to believe about Sarah Gannon, who wins the Pulitzer Prize in this case.
Yeah.
She's the one who breaks this story in March of 2011, the existence of a grand jury investigation into Jerry Sandusky for child sex abuse. At the time, she's a 24-year-old cub reporter at a small newspaper in Pennsylvania. She's a recent Penn State grad. By her own admission, she was a terrible Penn State student. Okay? And so she's the one that magically breaks what should be, frankly, illegal, which is the grand jury investigation. It's supposed to be secret. That's the entire purpose of a grand jury investigation. She breaks the existence of it. Now, I'll get to what I think was really going on after I tell you the story of Sarah Gannon. So when the story breaks nationally with Jerry Sandusky's arrest and the indictment of the Penn State administrators in November 2011, the national media converges on Little State College in 24 hours, and they need an expert. They need someone to tell them what the hell is going on here.
Right.
Well, they scoop up Sarah Gannon. I mean, my God, they lap that thing up like ice cream. I mean, they couldn't love this narrative more. Young, attractive female Penn Stater taking on Penn State football and bringing down this horrible sex crimes, the scandal. I mean, it is hosannas for Sarah Gannon immediately. Yeah. And she's a heroine, and she ends up winning the Pulitzer Prize. By the way, to show you what a joke the Pulitzer Prize is, at Jerry Sandusky's trial, and this is revealed in episode number 5 of the podcast, we learn the prosecution has to stipulate that Sarah Gannon was sending text messages to the moms of key accusers, urging them to go to the police because she was afraid that the investigation might get dropped. I mean, that is absolutely insane from a perspective of journalists. I sent that story to every member of her Pulitzer Prize jury, every single member. Yeah. I did not get one response, not one response, because they didn't care, because at that point she's a heroine. She wins. They gave her the Pulitzer Prize. They're not going to pull that back. But okay.
I have to stop us at this point, because what you just said is, I mean, you have no integrity anymore. Once
you're part of the team.
Yeah.
You're on the prosecution team. And that's just to finish my previous thought.
Yeah, please.
She was working on behalf of the prosecution. Her original story in March of 2011 was, I referred to it as a newspaper ad seeking new accusers of Jerry Sandusky because they couldn't find any credible accusers. So after 2 years of an investigation by the Attorney General's office, here's what they do. They find an ambitious young reporter, doesn't know what the hell she's doing, and they use her to leak this grand jury investigation so that they might finally be able to get some decent accusers. So what happens to Sarah Gannon after all this? And this, to me, is the part that doesn't make any sense. So we're to believe that at 23, 24, with no resources, I don't think she was even full-time when she began this whole thing. She's a part-timer. She has no resources. She breaks the biggest scandal in the history of college football and American sports in this century.
Yeah.
And she becomes famous. She never writes a book. Now, that right away is impossible. that is impossible. She wins the Pulitzer Prize, and she never writes a book about this case. That should blow the minds of anyone who is looking at this objectively. That's not possible.
Right.
That's a problem.
Yeah.
That's a problem. And by the way, it's not just because she's a crappy writer, which she is. She could find a ghostwriter. She can't write a book because she can't tell her real story.
Yeah.
If she tells her real story, she's going to expose herself as a fraud. But it gets worse than that. She doesn't write a book, Pete. She gets the job of a lifetime out of the publicity. She gets hired at CNN. So now she's a CNN reporter with unlimited resources. There's not a person on the planet that's not going to take her phone call. She's Sarah Ganim, Pulitzer Prize winning reporter for CNN. She does nothing at CNN. She is no longer at CNN. She very quietly left CNN a year or two ago. She's no longer in the business. The only thing she ever got known for at CNN was one, giggling on the set with Wolf Blitzer, ironically enough, while they were showing a videotape of a horrific abuse story, and that went viral. And she was covering a snowstorm, and she got a snowball thrown at her while she was live on the air. Those are her two contributions to her tenure at CNN, where she's no longer in the business. So you tell me, how is it possible you go from being a savant at 23, 24, winning the Pulitzer Prize, being a national heroine, to being out of the business much less than 10 years later, never having written a book, and having failed totally at CNN? I'm sorry, that doesn't add up. There's a problem here. And I think what it goes to is my, not just theory, but it's very clear reality, that she didn't do anything. She was a vehicle through which the prosecution needed to go to get more accusers. Because people, like everything in this case, it's the exact opposite of the perception. Everyone thinks that when this story breaks, my God, the case against Sandusky is so overwhelming. We don't even need to worry about that. But, we might focus on whether or not Joe Paterno really knew and whether he covered it up. So let's focus on that, because he's the only one we know. He's the celebrity. We don't even remember who Jerry Sandusky was. He's been out of coaching for 11 years at that point. So we don't have to worry about the Sandusky case. People don't understand, even I was slow to understand it, Pete, when Jerry Sandusky is arrested, even at that point, after a 3-year investigation, the case against him is incredibly weak. And it revolves around completely around Mike McQueary, the assistant football coach at Penn State, who is alleged to have witnessed some sort of assault between him and a boy in the shower at Penn State. And our first episode deals with why that story is not to be believed. And it has nothing to do with the actual acts of child molestation. It has simply to do with what the date was that episode actually happened. Our episode number 1 is called The Date, and it's because that was the first moment that I went, whoa, whoa, whoa.
Yeah.
We're gonna put all of this against Paterno and Penn State and Sandusky on a 10-year-old story where they get the date, the month, and the year wrong. Not once, but twice, in dramatic fashion, in a way that, as we explain in episode 1 of With the Benefit of Hindsight, completely changes the entire dynamic to now where we realize, wait a minute, McQueary did not witness a sexual assault.
I want to spend some time on the McQueary thing because it is so important to what you're talking about. The dates change. What he saw is sort of always unclear. Maybe it's a reflection. Maybe he saw something. And again, this is a football player-sized dude who is
huge. He's
physically
6'4", 230.
Has played.
He's a quarterback.
Right.
He's played at the highest levels
and does nothing to stop the abuse that he allegedly saw. Nothing to make because if you're abusing somebody and you're like, I don't know what's going on over there, I'm going to make my presence known. It's going to make the thing stop. You're going to do something. right?
You're at least going to find out who the kid is. You're going
Right.
to save him from the situation.
Yeah.
You know, most people are going to beat the crap out of Jerry Sandusky of what they really saw.
Or at least wave at him and be like, I see you, Jerry, you know, to let him, like, something. But he does nothing. And then there is no evidence that he actually says anything to Paterno about this. This is from what you said in the show. Joe's wife says no, that was like a 3.5 minute conversation or something like that. So there's nothing to even add up like, oh yeah, you know, he was so appalled that he waited however long it was to apparently report this thing. Like, he doesn't act like someone saw it.
Here's what you said is the natural reaction that most people have. That the number one question they've always had about McQueary is, if this is true, why didn't you do anything?
Right.
And what I say to that is, to understand McQueary's story, you need to understand one phrase: reverse engineering.
Okay.
This is a classic story of reverse engineering, where 10 years later, investigators desperately need him to come to a conclusion.
Right.
And the conclusion is, you saw Jerry Sandusky sexually abusing a boy, because they've got nothing.
Yeah.
This thing is going nowhere. They can't find anyone to back up victim number one, Aaron Fisher. So they're trying to drag McQueary to a conclusion. And then once they manipulate him into that conclusion, and I've used the Loch Ness Monster analogy, what I think happened here, and I really do believe this is a great analogy. I believe that in late 2000, which was a different date than he gave twice, Mike McQueary sees a ripple in the water and maybe a head poking out of the water in this loch. He's never been told there's a Loch Ness Monster there. He thinks it's weird. Yeah. It's worth noting to his father and his father's friend, boy, I saw this weird thing in the loch the other night. And I don't know what it was, and it weirded me out. And so then 10 years pass, and 10 years later, investigators come to him and say, we heard that you saw ripples in the loch and a head poking out of the loch. We got told this by a very weird tip from a former police officer out of Baltimore, which is a whole side story to this whole crazy thing. And we'd like to tell you, guess what? We now know there's a monster in that loch. We've got a boy named Aaron Fisher who claims that monster has been molesting him for years, and we really need to find that monster. And we need your help, and we think you can help us. Yeah. And Mike McQueary, not being very bright, he goes, and I think this is somewhat of a natural inclination. He goes, oh my God, that thing that I don't remember when it happened because I got because it wasn't that big of a deal.
Yeah.
Oh my God, I saw the Loch Ness Monster. And so now they're reeling him in to the notion that he saw the Loch Ness Monster. They push him a little bit, add a few details to the story that he didn't actually say. We have emails from Mike McQueary proving this. Mm-hmm. When the story breaks, he actually emails the main prosecutor, Janelle Esbach, and says, you guys are putting words in my mouth. I didn't say that. And so they get him across the finish line into an assault. Well, now they have to reverse engineer all the details over those 10 years in order to make that make sense. Mm. And part of the reverse engineering is, well, it wasn't that he didn't see anything and that's why he didn't attack Sandusky or save the boy. It's that he was so shocked. He was panicked. He didn't know what to do. And again, this is a massive young football player who quarterbacked Penn State in front of 100,000 people and on national television. So this is not the guy that is prone to total panic. But that's just part of the reverse engineering. There is reverse engineering on what he says to the administrators when they interview him. I've used another analogy, which our executive producer, Mike Agavino, doesn't like nearly as much as I do. But this, you're on Facebook, I'm on Facebook, and unlike Twitter, you're able to edit things that you say on Facebook. So here's the other analogy I put with regard to Mike McQueary's evolving story. So in 2001, Mike McQueary puts on Facebook, I did not see Jerry Sandusky sexually abusing a boy in the shower. And the Penn State administrators, Gary Schultz hits like, and Tim Curley hits like, and maybe even Joe Paterno hits like, and that's the end of it. Mm-hmm. And then 10 years later, Mike McQueary goes into his Facebook account and he edits out the word not.
Yeah.
And now all of a sudden, it looks like Gary Schultz and Tim Curley and Joe Paterno are liking and acknowledging that Mike McQuarrie said he saw Jerry Sandusky sexually abusing a boy in a shower. And this is not just a theory on my part. The guy, one of the two people that Mike McQuarrie says he told this story to immediately, Dr. John Dranoff, who was a mandated reporter in this case, if he had actually been told about sexual abuse and he didn't tell anybody about this, said under oath 3 times that Mike McQuarrie, I should reverse the way I said that. He says under oath that 3 times he asked Mike McQuarrie, did you see a sex act?
Yeah.
And Mike McQuarrie says no.
Yeah.
And this is contemporaneous. This is his own witness.
Yeah.
And so what we have here is a classic situation where 10 years later, the incentives have changed and we're telling a very different story. And by the way, there's strong evidence that after this alleged incident, Mike McQuarrie played in Jerry Sandusky sponsored golf tournaments. He physically joked around with him at an Easter Seals charity football game.
Again, these are actions of someone who didn't see a sexual assault.
Right. And most importantly, I discovered who the boy in the shower was.
Right.
And his name is Alan Myers. And when you know his story, you realize, wait a minute.
Yeah.
There's no possible way that guy was sexually abused that night or any other night. And it goes way, and we prove it in the podcast. It goes way beyond. I get, especially heterosexual boys not wanting to admit that this happened.
Sure.
I get that. But there's a line. There's got to be a line somewhere between the actions of someone who is ashamed that this happened and doesn't want to talk about it, and the actions of somebody who is looking at Jerry Sandusky as his father figure and never in a million years thought that Jerry Sandusky was sexually abusing him. And that person, Alan Myers, does not testify at Jerry Sandusky's trial. In fact, nobody testifies at Jerry Sandusky's trial as the so-called McQuarrie victim, which in a rational world, Pete, in a rational world,
doesn't make sense.
That would be something that would make people go, whoa, what? This is the most famous act of child molestation in the history of the United States. That's not an exaggeration.
Right.
This is the most, and everybody in the world knows about this.
Right.
Constant, massive news media coverage. And not only is there constant news media coverage, but there's all sorts of other victims that are supporting you. The media is supporting you. And there's going to be millions of dollars on the table given to you by Penn State. How is it possible that person isn't found and brought to testify? The prosecution actually tells, and I never really got into what a joke the trial is, but this is one of the many data points of what a joke the trial was. The prosecution actually tells the jury, Pete, this is a direct quote, because I'm sure that they probably thought, a juror or two might be a little concerned about where the hell our victim is for the McQuarrie episode, right? Yeah. I mean, someone might ask that question in the jury room. And so they tell the jury, the identity of victim number 2 is known only to God. Only to God. Now, that is, first of all, a lie. They knew who victim number 2 was. At least they should have known. They had more than enough information to know who victim number 2 was. They didn't like who victim number 2 was because they didn't like his story, and for 100 different reasons that we outline in the podcast. His story is completely inconsistent with the idea of someone who was ever abused. And by the way, he is on record on the day Joe Paterno was fired to an FBI-trained investigator, former police officer, saying, I'm the boy in the shower. I know things only the boy in the shower could possibly know. Mike McQuarrie is not telling the truth. Jerry Sandusky never abused me that night or any other night. He's the greatest thing that ever happened to me. And that's as a 24-year-old sergeant in the Marine Corps who is married. Okay, I'm sorry, that matters. That is not anything close to indicative of someone who is simply covering up for Jerry Sandusky because he doesn't want to admit that he was sexually abused as a child.
So, but we have to deal with the scoreboard. It's Jerry Sandusky's convicted, 45 counts. He's still in prison. If his case was handled poorly, I mean, there's appeals and all these other things, right. He's still in jail. So when we look at this, we're like, okay, there's no evidence. Yeah, there's no victims, no testimony. And if there before, this is the thing that John and I learned from you the first time around. It's like there before the grace of God, like you're sitting there if Sandusky didn't do these things, he's this. All this stuff happens to him, and he's like, "What am I going to do? I'm old. This is it."
Well, he was very naive. He was very poorly suited for this.
And by the way, why would Penn State cover up for a guy who doesn't even work there and hasn't worked there? None of this doesn't make any sense.
Right. 100% doesn't make any sense. But I'm not sure where you want me to go as far as
the case and the fact that he's still in jail.
Okay.
He's not, and
so
he's
how
not
did this
getting
happen? Okay. Well, the first thing I would counter on that is I have never heard of a serial child molester who is still appealing almost 10 years after their conviction. Now, if there's another case like that, someone please send it to me. But I've never heard of it. Here's a guy with no money other than a small pension that he gets, and he very limited ability to pay lawyers, and also less than zero political help in trying to get a new trial. One of the many, many, many elements of the perfect storm here is Pennsylvania judges, they're all elected, okay? Mm-hmm. So no Pennsylvania judge is going to force the innocent angels who were the victims of Jerry Sandusky to go through and endure another trial. Right. That is political death. You'll get destroyed in the media. So the state appeals were really nothing more than trying to get through the process to get into a federal court. And now that's where it is, or it's in the process of getting to a federal court.
A lot like the Armstrong, I guess you'd call it the scandal with Tour de France and doping and everything. We had all these guys, and none of them could break because it would take them all down, And then once it broke, it's like, okay, Floyd Landish talks more. We've had Floyd on the show, and they all had a chance to unload all these things that were on their minds. But that hasn't happened in this case. There are so many people that are like, I'm not going to be the first one to crack, and there's no reason.
There's some similarities there. There's actually a different similarity to the Lance Armstrong case, which I find fascinating. And that is two of Lance Armstrong's last defenders, two of them, Sally Jenkins and Buzz Bissinger. Buzz Bissinger, who I've had many run-ins with, was the author of Friday Night Lights. He wrote a Newsweek cover story, Why I Still Believe Lance Armstrong, well after it was obvious that Lance Armstrong was a fraud. Sally Jenkins wrote his autobiography, I believe, after it was clear, it wasn't as clear that he was a fraud. In fact, I confronted her when she wrote that book. I said, Sally, has it ever occurred to you that Lance Armstrong created Live Strong, the charity, as a cover so that the media would be more hesitant to be critical of him on this issue of drug use? And she responded to me, this was on an online chat, that's the most cynical and ridiculous thing she's ever heard in her career. Well, I was right. She was wrong. And the reason why this is related to this case, Bissinger and Sally Jenkins were two of Joe Paterno's biggest critics. Yeah. Now, I don't think that that's a coincidence. Yeah. That the last two people still being duped by Lance Armstrong were also duped into this idea that Joe Paterno was somehow guilty.
That's crazy.
And so I think that matters. But as far as the appeals are concerned, I would ask people to think, why is he still appealing? Why are legitimate lawyers still taking his appeals? Why? Why is he wasting money and resources if he must know he's guilty? He knows he has no political capital. There's a mountain of public sentiment against him and media sentiment against him. The only reason why he's appealing still is because he's innocent. And as far as the way the process goes, I've often said that again, it goes back to the perfect storm. Our system is set up in such a weird way that when there's no evidence against you and you get convicted, your appeal is actually much more difficult, because the way this works is there has to be something that gets found wrong at trial. Like, let's say, there was DNA evidence that turned out not to be him or something so that's a new trial, right? Yeah. But there was no DNA evidence. So it's like you're trying to shoot ghosts. There's no evidence to find a problem with. And so therefore an appeal, it's not based upon new evidence in most cases. you have to find something that was wrong with the original trial. Now, there's plenty wrong with the original trial. And I believe that a federal court that's rational will look at this and go, what the flying F was this?
Yeah.
Let me give you a real quick example that doesn't get talked about enough because there's so many elements of this case. Jerry Sandusky at his trial was convicted of 5 serious counts in the so-called janitor episode. That was so-called victim number 8, even though there was no victim number 8. So he gets convicted of 5 serious counts. And I'm not exaggerating, Pete. Here's what we know about those 5 counts. Those 5 counts, they do not have a victim. No victim testified. They do not have a date. They do not have a contemporaneous report. They do not have a direct witness because the only witness that testified were hearsay witnesses. Why? Because the supposed direct witness was said to have dementia. Why was it said he had dementia and couldn't testify? Well, at the time of the trial, we thought, well, he's just old and he has dementia. After trial, we learned, and we have this, it's documented, there was an interview with this janitor, the one that supposedly has dementia. His name's James Calhoun. And in that interview with investigators, and I would ask you, why are investigators interviewing someone that they are convinced has dementia, right? Now, you only interview someone if you think that they're going to give you something that's usable, that they're at least cognizant enough to give you a decent interview.
Sure.
And in this interview, he says, not once, not twice, but 3 times, it wasn't Jerry Sandusky that I saw. 3 times he says that. That does not even come up at trial because Jerry's defense attorney bought this idea that James Calhoun had dementia and it wouldn't be fair to bring that up. And I'm like, Joe, do you not understand that they determined that he had dementia after he gave the wrong answer? And Jerry got convicted of 5 counts in that episode. And there's other problems with the story. They changed the location.
I want to recap this because this is the stuff about these things. There are so many players, there are so many elements, but you just told me that victim A, and there's a lot of problems with all the victims. Victim A does not exist.
Does not exist.
There is no witness.
There's no
witness that they do offer is compromised mentally. So, I mean,
it gets even worse than that. He never testified at trial allegedly because of
never testified in trial.
And he has this interview that the jury never finds out about that he says it wasn't Jerry Sandusky that he saw. And then the prosecution, to get around this, they get the judge to give this cockamamie ruling that I'll allow hearsay evidence under an excited utterance exemption. And the prosecution promises they're going to have 2 witnesses that say that James Calhoun told them about this, even though they never said anything about it to anybody, back when it happened in the 2000 range. Well, guess what happens? The judge grants this crazy exemption, and then only one of the 2 janitors actually testifies.
Yeah.
So what happened to the second janitor?
Yeah. Well, I'm no lawyer, but I feel like I could do all right in this case. It's like, what the heck happened?
The fact that no one ever talks about the janitors aren't even in the top layer of the insanity,
right?
But he got convicted. That's how what a joke the jury was. The jury decided, beyond a reasonable doubt, we're going to convict him on all 5 of those counts.
Yeah.
It's
another thing that's happened in the meantime since all this is that we've seen all these documentaries where the DA, the police, all these people are compromised because they fixate on some aspect of the case and say this is the guy no matter what, to the point where they have DNA evidence that exonerates that person, and they still are like, and we've seen this over and over again. I'm not saying it happens all the time.
Investment,
but it does seem to happen here.
Well, it's a little different here in that in those cases, it usually at least have a dead body.
Right.
Here, there's no dead body.
Right.
There's no evidence of an actual crime that even took place. And so we're presuming.
Yeah, and in those cases, there's actually a perpetrator on the loose still. But it's not even a perpetrator in this case.
Right. Which, again, it's all part of the perfect storm. And so the reality is that, Jerry is trying to prove something that did not happen and has lost all presumption of innocence.
Right.
This is the classic case where you must maintain the presumption of innocence because that's all the defendant has.
Yeah.
And frankly, this idea, and I talked to Tom Mesereau, Michael Jackson's attorney, about this, and he's as equally horrified as I am. and he agrees with me about most of the case, so he hasn't delved into it deeply. He wrote an op-ed on my recommendation asking for Jerry to get a new trial. But, this idea that you're allowed to have 8 people, although the media thought it was 10, 8 different accusers testify at the same trial for episodes that were completely different from one another.
Right.
That is inherently unfair to me. And I'm a prosecution guy. I believe everybody is guilty. I'm a conservative. I mean, I want bad guys put in jail. But because what ends up happening, let's go back to the janitors. If the janitor episode had been the only thing at this trial, the jury would have laughed at. Any jury would have laughed at that. But because it's connected to all these other accusers, and there's a presumption, they can't all be lying, right? Yeah. So even
if you're on the jury, you don't want to be the one that I'm for the child abuser,
right?
How do you?
But there's psychologically, every allegation becomes exponentially stronger because there's others with it. But yet, what I always say to people, and it's the number one question I ask people who confront me about this, is just tell me which accuser you believe and why. Yeah. Just tell me which one you believe, because individually, none of them. I don't believe, and in fact, the proof of it is that Jerry Sandusky was investigated for 3 years without an arrest. Yeah. For 3 years. So they didn't believe in any one of these accusers.
They certainly couldn't prove it. I mean, that's the thing. That's why they didn't arrest.
Right, they didn't arrest him. Now they'll claim, he was such a giant figure. That's one of the great misconceptions. Jerry Sandusky had been retired from Penn State football for a decade at this point. He was a goofy guy running a charity he didn't even drive a nice car. None of these kids looked at him as a god. Aaron Fisher, victim number 1, it was at most 6 years old the last time Jerry Sandusky ever coached a football game. Right. They did not look at him as a godlike figure. He was a former assistant coach that old people seem to like for some reason. There was no godlike powers there. And so I think that's important for people to understand. But the idea that somehow every allegation gets more strength because of others that were somewhat similar is a very dangerous concept. Yeah. To me, they ought to be forced to go to trial one by one. And I realize that makes it more difficult to get a conviction, but I think that the pendulum has now swung so far in the other direction. We kind of alluded to this at the beginning of the interview. Yeah. There was a time, 50s, 60s, 70s, maybe into the 80s, where we were too hesitant to believe allegations like this, and we corrected, and boy did we correct. Yeah. And now we've gone so far in the other direction where it's almost impossible to defend yourself now, especially if there are special circumstances like there were in this case.
You've done so much work. You've talked to so many people. You've interviewed Jerry Sandusky. You've interviewed or had some very heated conversations with the Paterno family, various members. And
you got to check out episode 3. Yeah, the phone call with Scott Paterno. It's off the rails.
Craziness. But even in the Paterno family, they don't agree on how to approach this. They've all lockstep behind Scott, but there's so much disagreement. There's so much. None of this makes sense. And a lot of times crimes don't make sense, but there's just so much chicanery and untruthfulness, and why are all these things? I guess what I'm asking you is if Jerry does win on appeal and gets out, does it make a difference, or is his life just over anyhow?
Well, his life is over. He's getting old at this point. He survived COVID, which I found interesting. I was convinced at a certain point that the only way symbolically for this to end was for Jerry Sandusky to die of COVID in prison. Yeah. But he survived that. He's psychologically, I'm told he's doing very, very well. If he were to get out, I don't know what could possibly happen. It would probably be bad. I wouldn't even want him to be just released. I don't think that would happen anyway. I think what should happen is there should be another trial. Mm-hmm. And if you had another jury say, wait a minute, this was not right, this was wrong, and he would be acquitted, then I think that at least then he could live out whatever is left of his life in peace. I think most people would accept that. There would be some blowback, I'm sure. But I think at this point, the truth is what really matters here. And it's not just Jerry Sandusky, and it's not just the legacy of Joe Paterno. Graham Spanier is still facing jail time in this case. Gary Schultz and Tim Curley went to jail, had their lives destroyed, their reputations destroyed. These were men with sterling reputations. And so there's been so much injustice, not to mention, the whole history of Penn State football. Penn State football's history in the Paterno era has been erased from sports history. And it's all based upon, in my opinion, a nonsensical lie.
Are the other guys still fighting? Are they still trying to appeal and, have this jail time removed and the conviction removed?
Well, no, Tim Curley and Gary Schultz pled guilty to a misdemeanor, thinking, and I understand it, I didn't agree with it, but I understand it. They looked at it and they go, the jury pool is so polluted against us. I mean, there was actually a poll. It
seems like that's the perfect place to have a change of venue, because how can you do that anywhere near that? I mean, Penn State is such a powerful thing there.
So I mean, there was actually a poll, Pete, poll, and I don't remember the exact number, but it was in the high 70s, I believe, that basically asked, do you think the administrators should go to jail even if they didn't actually cover up for Jerry Sandusky?
Yes.
And it was like 70-some% said yes.
There's a problem.
Now, how in the world can you possibly get a fair trial? And so they were offered a misdemeanor. Now, a misdemeanor, as you know, for someone with a sterling record, is not going to result in jail time, right? And so, and I would have told them this, that I'd known them at the time, this case breaks all the norms. But they were under the impression that this would help them avoid jail time and have it go away. And that way everyone, because frankly, I don't even think the prosecution really believed in the cover-up theory. I really don't. I mean, I attended the Spanish trial. And it just felt to me like they were working on nothing but outrage about the case, and that they needed to get some sort of conviction to warrant and justify those original indictments back in 2011. And so they were thrilled to get a guilty plea, even if it was a misdemeanor. Well, then the judge turns, and because of all the publicity in this, and doesn't want to be the judge that doesn't send Jerry Sandusky's enablers to jail, he sends them to jail. And we have 4 hours of interviews with Gary Schultz, the only interviews he's ever done in this case. And he explains that, and he explains a whole lot else from a very, very different perspective. Frankly, if there's one thing I wish people would listen to, it would be our second interview with Gary Schultz, which you can find at framingpaterno.com. Just go to our page for the podcast with the benefit of hindsight, and there's 2 interviews there with Gary Schultz. And the second one, it's a little over 2 hours long. And if you listen to that and you believe that, one, there was a cover-up, and 2, that Jerry Sandusky, there's any evidence of Jerry Sandusky's guilt, I'm sorry, there's nothing else I can do, because that, to me, proves the whole case.
You've been at this for a long time. I remember the last time we were here in your kitchen, you were talking about it, and it was wearing you out. When are you going to let it go?
My plan is to let it go November 10th of this year. Because that'll be 10 years plus 1 day.
And then are you writing a book?
Well, I would write a book if anyone was going to publish it, but no one's going to publish my book. That's, my podcast is basically a book. I mean, it is 19 episodes of incredibly detailed. I mean, I just it's a warehouse for almost everything I have accumulated.
It's remarkable how much you know about this case.
It's been an insane ride. It's been the worst thing that's ever happened in my career. One of the worst things that's ever happened in my life. I'm in a better mindset than the last time you were in my kitchen, because at that point I was still going through the mourning process of this is never going to be fixed. And now, I feel like I'm kind of talking about a dead person, and I'm just providing the world with the real autopsy, as opposed to trying to revive a life that still had a chance. I mean, I would like to see Jerry's federal appeal be properly heard, because I am quite certain that a proper federal judge will be horrified at the record of this case. Even if they believe Jerry is guilty, they'll be horrified by the record of this case. But I also feel I've been at least somewhat vindicated. The Malcolm Gladwell book, I think, was, Rational World was large vindication. I've had many people now who have spoken on the podcast who would never, 5 years ago, I never would have dreamed would do an interview with me saying Jerry Sandusky was innocent. Gary Schultz saying that should be national news, but it's not because of this story. 2 Penn State board members, Al Lord and Bob Caprello, saying to me that they believe Jerry Sandusky is innocent is remarkable. These are very well-respected business leaders, and as I said, members of the Penn State Board of Trustees. Bruce Heim, the guy who funded and founded the Second Mile charity, who at one point believed Jerry was guilty because of all the media hysteria. He has now reversed himself and says, no, Jerry was actually innocent, and explains why. We've been able to tell the story of our fake accuser, the purposely fake accuser who did a 3-year-plus sting operation on the main lawyer and therapist in the case. His story is just bonkers and really, should expose just how easy this really all was. Even just the other day, we got Kevin Horn, former editor of the Penn State publication Onward State, who covered the trial, to admit, Jerry Sandusky is innocent. The fact that the Pendergrass book and other things have happened, I can at least sleep well at night knowing that I did the right thing. It hurt, it harmed me. But Joe Paterno on his deathbed said, just find the truth. Yeah. And I believe that we have found the truth. Do I have every single I dotted and T crossed, and am I 100% right about everything? I doubt it.
But you can create reasonable doubt across almost every aspect of this case.
Oh, beyond reasonable doubt. I believe, to me, Pete, and one of my favorite episodes in the podcast is when I explain what I think really happened. And when I go through what really happened, what people I hope are going to find is, wow, that story makes a hell of a lot more sense than the one we were told. Because the one we were told, if you think about it with a clear eye, and I'm mixing metaphor, but if you think clearly about it, makes absolutely no sense. Now, nonsensical things happen all the time, but there's evidence for it. And in this case, there's no evidence.
When you're talking about exceptions, this is a case that is rife with exceptions. And again, that creates doubt. Like the fact that the timelines change, the stories change, that, the lack of evidence. I mean, a witness only known to God, that is not a witness.
And wait till you find out about Jerry Sandusky's medical records.
Oh, boy.
Yeah, the medical records, which we've not divulged publicly yet, I think for most people is going to be the final nail in the coffin. You're going to go, what the hell is this?
Yeah. It's crazy. And you're right. There's so much doubt with everything that they say, and so much incentive to keep the story alive and to get paid and all these other things. It's a shame that some people's lives are irreparably damaged and ruined because of this. And then, by the way, that there's still child predators out there doing things every day, and we struggle with this as a nation to take it seriously because it goes right into conspiracy territory. We talk about Q and protect our children, and it's like, but there really are human trafficking going on within the country. It's terrible, and we have all this energy and effort.
But I actually see it from a slightly different perspective. I think one of the legacies that's really important with the Sandusky case is not just all the damage done to the people directly involved in the Penn State, but, I can't stand the fact that, I'll take it, the theoretical into the practical. I mentioned I have 2 young daughters. We spent a lot of time on playgrounds, right, over the last several years. For some reason, a lot of kids gravitate towards me. And they'll ask me, can you swing me on the swing or push me down the slide or whatever? And I have to beg off. Yeah. I can't do it, not because there's anything wrong with it, just because we're now living in an atmosphere where anything can be misperceived. And especially given my role in this case, I would be incredibly easy target for anybody. Right. And I hate that. Yeah. I mean, that's we shouldn't be living in that kind of world. Yeah. And that's one, I think the Sandusky case has pushed us in that direction.
Yeah, it's the media has only gotten worse in terms of sacrificing integrity. There's no Edward R. Murrow or someone that we trust anymore because, I'll just be open about it. David Muir was talking during the Dallas, Texas storms this past winter about how there's, cold storage trucks being sent to harbor the bodies. But That isn't what happened, but they only sold that aspect of it. Was it a terrible storm? Did people die? Yes, of course, that's all newsworthy and everything. But they sold the terror, the fear of all of it. And that's just emergency management. Like, hey, we have all of these resources, we have to flex them in because we have this crisis going on. It doesn't make that newsworthy. The newsworthy part is that, there is some
the news is fundamentally broken. And the reason why the news is fundamentally broken is because the business model is broken.
Yeah.
And so therefore they have to continually inject fear and scandal and outrage and push their agenda. But plus the lid has completely come off. The genie is out of the bottle when it comes to bias. I mean, because there's no stopping it now. And so, to me, the mainstream news media is inherently not just flawed, it's beyond broken. In this case, and frankly, because of my knowledge of the media, is how and why I was able to figure out what happened in this case, because I was impervious to media coverage. The media coverage meant nothing to me.
Yeah.
And it had a huge impact on most people, right? I mean, understandably so, because I have been educated in the news media in a way that very few other people have. This was not my first rodeo.
Right.
I've been involved in other similar stories where the media blew it. So just because the media reporting something universally with no scrutiny had the opposite impact on me. I almost automatically presume, well, that can't be true.
Right.
Because, that's the way the media works. And everyone's just copying and pasting and no one's actually vetting any of this.
Right.
When everyone else is going, oh my God, everyone's reporting it, it must be true. I'm like, no. It's the opposite.
Yeah.
It's the opposite. If everyone's telling you something immediately with no scrutiny, no vetting, and it fits their agenda, look out. It's almost surely not true.
This goes again to the media thing where, like, if there is a hate crime, if there's a presence of a noose, if the word Trump, these are instant indicators you've got a problem. Maybe it is a hate crime, but there are so many instances of
almost
this
never.
where you
almost
see,
never.
Yeah,
it almost never turns out to be what they claim.
Right. The hate crime thing is crazy, and it goes to these kind of things too, where you can advance a narrative, even if you in your heart believe it's true. It's like the presence of a lot of the specters that are haunting us, whether it's the virus. And I'm not saying the virus is not real, just all these things. The panic that comes in is always, this was true in Iraq and Afghanistan. The panic was always bigger than the actual threat, always. And so until we realize that thing, whether it's racism or poverty, wherever it is, we can't deal with these real problems because we're so worried about these specters, these ghosts, these monsters that live in these logs.
I couldn't agree more. And I wish people were aware of it. And that's part of why we did the podcast. I mean, this podcast goes way beyond, to me, Penn Staters really even shouldn't be the target audience for this thing. The target audience should be people who want to understand about our media and the nature of humanity and how this kind of thing can easily happen now and how it's got to be stopped so it doesn't keep happening.
Yeah. Are you ever going to get invited to dinner at the Paterno house?
Again, no. I've been to the Paterno house, but I'll never be invited there again. And by the way, that's part of why I am the guy who figured out what really happened here. One of the weird quirks of this story is that the people most interested in this story were inherently handicapped in figuring out what happened because they were all Penn Staters, which meant they were all admirers of Joe Paterno, which meant that they were all unwilling to go against the family. And so I come in and I'm not a Penn Stater and I don't care about whether the Paterno family likes me or not. I don't care.
Right.
And that's the only way I was able to it took me a long time, longer than it should have. I made a lot of mistakes along the way, but that's what enabled me to figure this out. A Penn Stater that was beholden to the Paterno family, and specifically to Scott Paterno, who's a lunatic and invested in his own self-interest, could never have done it. And so I've often joked with people that I was almost perfectly built for this case in a lot of different, almost weird ways, and that's one of them. You
have been very emotional about your conversations and interaction with Franco Harris. What is Franco's overall position, would you say, or can you say for him?
Well, Franco's publicly stated many times, by the way, for those who don't know, NFL legend, Hall of Famer, went to Penn State, by far the most high-profile defender of Joe Paterno. His stake in this has always been Joe Paterno.
Okay.
He knows that Joe Paterno didn't do anything wrong here. He knows Joe very, very well. He also doesn't believe Penn State did anything wrong here. And he believes that Jerry Sandusky's trial was not legitimate and the due process was not.
It's still due.
Right. There was no due process in the trial. He acknowledges that, and that Jerry Sandusky should have a new trial. He has left it to me to fight the Jerry Sandusky battle, and I totally respect that because unlike Franco, I don't have statues in Pittsburgh that can be taken down.
Right.
But I have an enormous amount of respect for Franco. In fact, I would say Franco is one of maybe only a couple people for whom I have more respect at the end of this than I did at the beginning. Most people I have far less respect for than I did at the beginning. And it's really a bizarre aspect of this situation for me personally. I grew up as a Philadelphia Eagle fan, hating the Steelers in the 1970s, didn't like Franco Harris, thought he was a coward for running out of bounds all the time. And now I actually think he's one of the wisest athletes I've ever run across. And by the way, he was right to run out of bounds all the time because he's still got his wits about him.
Yeah.
He and I talk about that all the time. And he's just a very, very wise man. He's a slow talker, which can be frustrating. But,
especially for you.
Right. But I mean, we are the oddest couple on the planet. I mean, when you put me and Franco together, it's about as odd as it gets. But we've been in a foxhole together numerous times over the last 9 years. And he's the one that told me, you just do what you have to do to find the truth. And that meant a lot to me. And because no other athlete of his status would have maintained our relationship over the last 9 years under the controversy that I've endured. I mean, from battles with Scott Paterno to being arrested, Matt Sandusky. I mean, I got arrested, which is part of the podcast later on, which is a bonkers story. I got arrested simply attending Matt Sandusky's first speech in Pennsylvania since the scandal broke. Matt Sandusky's probably the biggest fraud in this whole thing. And the arrest of me was beyond a joke. And the night after I got arrested, after I had played golf at Oakmont, a country club in Pittsburgh, where obviously Franco lives, and he'd gotten out at that point. I had been arrested, and who shows up to have dinner with me at Oakmont Country Club and have my picture taken with him in front of the trophies at Oakmont Country Club, but Franco Harris. Right. Now that's insane. I mean, no other major celebrity would have done that in a million years, but Franco did, and I have enormous respect for him because of that.
It speaks a lot to his character, and it says a lot about the work that you've done. Just two basic questions left. The first one is regrets.
You don't have enough time for all my regrets. I have made so many mistakes, but I think that the number one, if I had an opportunity to go back and do it again, when I did the first Today Show interview after the interview with Jerry Sandusky, and that was with Matt Lauer, and that was a huge deal at the time. And ironically enough, Matt and I are we're very close friends now. We talk almost all the time, bizarrely, for reasons that have nothing directly to do with this case, but more have to do with his situation. I made two massive errors in hindsight, to coin a phrase. And one of them was I should never have told the Today Show producer that I was going to use the name of victim number 2, because that completely sent everything sideways. I should have probably just done it and not said I was going to do it. But even more importantly than that, after the interview with Jerry Sandusky, I should have followed my instincts. And this is one of the things that I would urge people to do in these situations. Almost invariably, the only times I've ever gotten in trouble, Pete, is when I don't follow my instincts. And my instincts after that interview were, that second McQueary date is not right. Jerry knows. He knows in his bones that second McQueary date is not right. And it just, I couldn't understand how that would be possible. The prosecution could get it wrong that badly twice. And I did a very cursory investigation of the date, and I should have continued on with it there was a lot going on preparing for the Today Show interview, and my head was spinning, and I had a lot of balls in the air, and I dropped it. And it was a huge mistake because in theory, if I had, it was possible, I could have done this. If I had been able to go on to the Today Show and say, look, I found out two things, Matt. Number one, that date of the McQuarrie episode that got changed already once, it's wrong. It's wrong again. And Mike McQuarrie waited 6 weeks to go see Joe Paterno. And oh, by the way, the boy in the shower that didn't testify, I know who he is. And let me tell you a little bit about his story.
Yeah.
If I would have been able to do that, I would like to believe that it would have been early enough to where that would have mattered.
Yeah.
But I screwed up. I made two critical errors there. So those are the two of many. Those are the two biggest regrets I had.
What's next for you? November 11th.
I probably nothing. I'm probably going to retire from public life at that point. I mean, I'm not being facetious. I mean, I don't see how there's going to be opportunity for me to do much more after this. I know the political realm, I'm persona non grata basically because I was the last conservative to hate Trump, but I also hate liberals now because of what happened with COVID reaction. So I have no tribe politically, and that's the only thing that matters. You got to have a tribe.
Yeah.
So there's no tribe politically. The only people that follow my work are people that really care about the truth, which is a very small percentage of the population. And there are things I'd like to do, things I'd really like to do, but I just don't see that I'm going to have the opportunity to do them because unless this case somehow gets close to fixed, or this podcast does much better than I anticipated doing, I don't see another chapter. Now, stranger things have happened, but I'm mentally prepared for, my wife to go back to work and for me to, be a stay-at-home dad for the rest of my life.
Nothing wrong with that.
Well, we'll see. I mean,
all right, stand by for a second. Let me get this thing wrapped up. Hey, thanks for watching the show. I really appreciate it. Right here, you can subscribe. Please do that. It makes the show grow. Hit that notification bell so you know which incredible guest is coming up next. Down below is the PayPal link. You can put a small subscription in. That is an enormous help. All that money goes right back into the show. And then right up over here are the next episodes you should listen to, curated by yours truly. Thank you so much for